Hey there, it's Bob from Coffee Cup, also known as Bob the Grid Builder. This video is the first in a new series that teaches the mechanics of CSS Grid, while also creating fallbacks for the very few browsers that do not support this awesome new layout system. If you keep following along, you will be making cool grid-based designs like this one before you know it. Let's get started with setting up our first grid parent. To do so, we drop a container div that will create the grid layout for its children. The grid styles will be tied to the grid demo class. Before we define the grid styles, let's add the grid elements, also known as grid children. That way, we can see the changes as soon as we start applying the grid styles. You can see that I cheated a little bit by pre-creating the little box that we are going to use in these videos. Now I just need to add it in from the project components pane. After duplicating it a few times and editing all the box titles, we have enough content to work with. So, on the grid part, you will be surprised how straightforward this is going to be. Just one more step before we get gritty though. CSS is well supported by modern browsers. Chrome, Firefox, Safari and the latest version of Microsoft Edge all understand the grid display rules. For browsers that do not support CSS Grid, older browsers like IE11, we want to keep things separate. Therefore, we place all the grid related styles in a feature query. This feature query will test if CSS Grid is supported. The test is added through the Design For dialog. Now, all the styles we add will be correctly interpreted by modern browsers, yet they will be ignored by IE11. Don't worry if you don't grasp the feature query concept immediately. I will dedicate an entire later episode to the how and why of feature queries. Now, with that behind us, simply change the display for the grid parent to grid. With that, a grid is automatically generated based upon the content inside of the grid container. Only it is a row-based grid, which you can see when we open the grid editor. On small screens, we want to create a two-column grid. First, let's remove all those rows. They will be generated as needed by the browser anyway. I will get back to this behavior or feature of CSS Grid in a later episode. For now, let's create two fluid columns of equal width. You can do that with the FR unit, which is also a new awesome addition by CSS Grid. I will address this new unit in more detail in one of the upcoming episodes as well. If you're dying to find out how this handy new unit behaves right away, I suggest to head over to cssgrid.cc/guide as soon as this episode is over. Now let's duplicate that one FR column and see what our grid items will do. Swoop! They all automatically take up a single grid cell based upon their order from left to right. No width needs to be specified on the items themselves. It's all automatic. To continue, let's update this to a 3-column structure at the first breakpoint. Simply move the slider, open the grid editor, duplicate a column, and done. This is one of the big advantages of CSS Grid. It's super fast and easy to reconfigure for the different screen widths. I am just moving the slider back and forth a bit for the gigs of it. And to see what this will look like in IE11, simply toggle the Design For drop-down back to fallback first. It does not have the fancy grid looks, but all the content is still safely there. Let's do one more thing before we reach the end of this first episode. Something that grids are famous for: adding a gutter. First, we verify that we are designing for browsers that support CSS Grid and that we have the grid parent selected. Then it's a matter of launching the grid editor, toggling the settings section and specifying the gutter width. In this example, I start with a gutter of 10 pixels between both the rows and the columns. Please note that a gutter is only created between the elements. Before grid, we had to use margins on each of the elements to pull this off, which then inevitably would also show up on the sides, creating misalignment between sections and other layout nightmares. Another example of the awesomeness of grid. For the kicks of it, let's change the grid configuration at the 1024 pixel breakpoint too. Since there's more space, I'm adding one more column. Plus, I add more space between the columns. Bam! That took me a whole 2 seconds. Faster than hand coding grid configurations, but also much faster than working with any of the older grid frameworks. This wraps up episode 1. If you want to stay in the know on everything related to CSS Grid and layout and digital design in general, make sure to subscribe to the Grid Builder newsletter at the top of the page. Thank you all!